you know, it's an interesting thing, you know, culturally. I do find that, you know, one of the things when you come from an ex-slave society is that your society evolves in a particular way, and part of it is this notion that you cannot rest. It's not a good thing, but there is a strong, sort of deeply embedded idea that you can't rest. Resting is not allowed.
Yes.
So I do need to be reminded. Yes.
Well, and leadership positions like yours result from having that kind of work ethic. At the same time, when we look back at this time from the future, I think it's going to be, we're going to go, I'm glad I took care of myself as I was doing that work, as opposed to the alternative.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Tess, are you hearing me well? Because I'm hearing Joyce a little bit delayed. Are you hearing it right though?
Yes, I'm hearing it well. Yeah.
And you're hearing Joyce as well?
I'm hearing Joyce as well. Yeah.
Good. I don't care what I hear. I just more care about what people are hearing. Yeah. Good. Okay.
I think we might have Greg joining us on the line as well now. Yeah, but he's just connecting to audio right now.
Hello, Greg. So there is, June, there is a bit of delay for me from time to time. We just have to accept that. I was telling Tessica that even when I'm working from, you know, the urban office with all of its, you know, with wired in fiber connections, and I'm talking to my deputy ministers and office staff in Eastern Canada, we have people fading off and voices going weird, and so I've accepted that as part of the normal of this virtual meeting option.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't think most of us understood that, right? Because we were so used to, well, the impact on the system has been enormous as well.
Yes, well, that's it. So many people using these collaborative and virtual meetings that
And just so for everyone that's joining us on the line right now, we've allowed folks to join the webinar a little bit early, but don't worry, you're not late. We're just having Joyce and Dr. June Francis chat a bit informally, and we'll be starting the webinar at 10.
Yeah, June and I are catching up after not having chatted. I think, June, the last time that we visited or talked to each other was perhaps when you were a part of the informal advisory group that I was working with on the Jerko lands to make sure that we were.
That, yes.
I just want to see.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's.
Yeah, and it's good. I've always followed that. That's been an interesting, you know. But you're right. That's the last time we saw each other in person. Actually, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, and just in case I never connected you with where that went, the informal advisory group, which brought together a range of different perspectives to inform the Canada lands and the city about our view of the process. The key thing that we brought forward after all those meetings was that we wanted the public voice to be included right from the beginning. And so that became the focus, is that it can't be just the owners deciding what to do, or just the city and the owners together, and the public brought in after the fact. The public had to be brought in from the very beginning. And I got that written agreement from the project management leads in Canada Lands, and the city also agreed with that proposition. And so there is a public now, advisory group of the public who are involved in these steps that the city and the owners are taking to get to a vision for the lands.
Well, that's good. And hopefully it is a process that is effective, because sometimes these processes, again, unless people really hear what they need to hear. And I guess it's also about learning about each other too. That's the other part. It's never, I see Greg's joined us.
Hi, Dr. Francis. Hi, Joyce. Hi, Jessica. I'm so sorry. I was actually on, but I was trying to fit in or finish a phone call while I was logging in. So forgive me for not turning on about a minute ago.
Yeah, no worries. We're still a couple of minutes away from formally starting. We have opened the lines to participants, and so I see
Great.
that there's a number of people have already connected in. So thanks for coming in a bit early.
Oh, of course.
And Greg, this will be the first time that you and I have chatted with video. It's really since Parliament, since we were all sent home.
Well, I mean, aside from those briefings.
Yes, well, aside from, well, you have been on the briefings, and
That's right.
we've had some telephone calls to keep up and catch
Yes.
up and work together on the many. And I'll be introducing you as a parliamentary secretary who supports me in the work I do. But for this occasion, your key leadership role with the Black parliamentarians takes priority and is the important role. Yeah.
Well, it's it's sort of a funny thing about that. I sort of feel like a bit of a figurehead, because it's really the hard work is done by people like Dr. Francis and others in the communities across the country, in terms of bringing forward good policies, ideas for the last 4.5 years. So it's nice to see it all come. What do they say? You have to work very hard to become an overnight success, and I'm glad that we worked for a long period of time on these issues, so that when we were able to come forward, we were able to do so credibly.
And I do hope, because it's so funny, because as soon as you said that, the other one that we always say, I thought of, that we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. That's not going to be the case anymore. Working twice as hard to get half as far. So
let's hope not.
But of course, it's not just the community work, but there's a work that you do in the halls of power that we need to, obviously, it's critically important. And I'm the first to say that.
Well, that's why when we have, Joyce and I have been friends for, how long has it been, Joyce? It's been like 13 years, 15 years, it's been a while.
Yeah,
when did you first win?
I ran I first ran in 2006 with Paul Morton's last election.
Right.
And you may have been the LPC lead at that time.
I was one of the. I wasn't.
I'm going to interrupt you only because I can see Jessica is getting stressed.
Oh, that's right. Poor Jessica. Sorry.
Okay,
I had to stop you because I thought she was going to have a stress.
Thanks.
You're right.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in to say it is too. So we'd love to start the webinar and to hear from you both. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second virtual MP Brunch Connections event on how Canadians can uproot anti-Black racism and systemic discrimination. We're so lucky to have Dr. June Francis and MP Greg Fergus here, both with us. But before we get started, I want to turn it over to Honorable Joyce Murray, our MP here in Vancouver Quadra, to kick it off and to share some opening words.
Well, thanks, Jessica. And welcome everyone to our MP Brunch Connections. Thanks for joining this discussion on this really incredibly important issue and opportunity at this time to really make a difference and addressing anti-Black racism. So I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the traditional Coast Salish territory, and which is the traditional lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations. Welcome, Dr. Francis and Parliamentary Secretary Greg Fergus. So I have the great privilege of having Greg as my parliamentary secretary as a minister, which means he works very closely with me and the department in the work that we do and I do as Minister of Digital Government. He is also the parliamentary secretary to the president of the Treasury Board, Jean-Yves Duclos. So Greg is doing quadruple duty between those two things, those two parliamentary secretary roles and his role as a leader of the Black Caucus, as well as being a member of parliament. So a busy guy, Greg. And I really appreciate June and Greg for joining us. Usually with my MP breakfast, I take a moment to just give a bit of a snapshot from Ottawa for my guests. And so I'm going to do that again here. So firstly, well, one part of the snapshot is that my background, you can see, is not urban Vancouver. So I've had a chance to take a couple of days off here. And so that's one of the great things about virtual meetings, is that I could come to our cabin in the woods, and I could also be part of, continue with this initiative. So back in Ottawa, well, so I think firstly, virtual parliament is something, virtual parliament is something that was a big experiment. We were many hours a day having our, I guess it was called the COVID-19 committee, but it really functioned as parliament in many ways, including an hour-and-a-half question period every day, 4 days out of 5. So that put us ministers on our toes. We had to listen very carefully for the questions so we could be prepared to answer. And there was many other ways that it functioned as parliament, but of course not everything. And we were not able to vote, but we will be, I presume, we will be finding ways to vote virtually in the fall. So who knows how this will continue to unfold, but it's been an experiment that I think has served Canadians pretty well given the challenges of COVID-19. In terms of my ministry, I think the key project that I'm excited about right now, excuse me, just a moment.
Okay.
I've got a husband doing a few repair projects around the cabin as we speak, so I've asked him to turn off the power tools for now. So in terms of the ministry, the thing that I'm really excited about right now, and I know you've heard me, and if you get my emails, I've spoken a bit about the digital government public servants, did so much to help the government be able to be functional, working remotely from their homes with the equipment, the tools to be able to work in teams and serve Canadians. So that was in the first couple of months, a huge focus of digital government. We've also been working to put together digital tools to help you and others to access government's benefits. So for example, there's a benefit finder. So if you're not sure that you have had access to the funding and support that you're eligible for, you can look for the Finding Financial Help for COVID-19 on your computer, and that app will make sure that you have the support that you're entitled to. So now we're working on what's called a exposure notification app. So digital government is the technical lead on that, and the idea is that soon there will be a pilot project in Ontario. It will be a national approach. It will alert you when you've been exposed within 2 meters to someone who has tested positive for the virus. And that means you can then take the measures that are appropriate, staying away from vulnerable family members in your bubble, just watching carefully for any symptoms, perhaps getting tested. And so that is one of the portfolio of things that we are hoping as a government will help us to be able to restart the economy as quickly and as fully as is safe. So this is something that's been exciting to be part of, and I am optimistic that it will be public before too long and you'll have more details about it. So now for the brunch and our special guests. Anti-Black racism is, of course, a scourge in Canada as it is in the United States. There's been recent tragedies, particularly in the United States, that have really raised this issue in a way that has struck Canadians as well as Americans. And we've seen the outpouring of concern and gatherings to show support for the Black community and for other victims of racism. But here we're here today to find out more and talk more about what we can do to really address anti-Black racism once and I mean, I shouldn't say once and for all, but in a way that really makes a meaningful difference to that unacceptable aspect of our society here in Canada. So I'm actually really proud of the work that our government has done on anti-Black racism, and so I'm going to ask Greg Fergus, the Parliamentary Secretary to me as the Minister of Digital Government, MP, and Chair of the All-Party Black Caucus. The caucus has recently tabled a statement with 5 recommendations for Canada to address anti-Black racism. It was signed by 143 members, and I can assure you I was quick to add my name to that. I was very proud of your work, Greg. Thank you for being with us today, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and thank you everyone for joining in this this online consultation to talk about a really important issue, and it's going to be one of the issues of our times. First of all, especially to Dr. Francis, as well as anyone else who has been working in this field for a number of years, the work that we've been doing as a Parliamentary Black Caucus, frankly, is work that frankly, we're standing on your shoulders and the shoulders of giants in terms of being able to take the work that you've put in for a number of years and try to synthesize it all into a number of things that we can take forward. So, folks, let's get down to brass tacks. What are we talking about here? What is systemic racism? What is unconscious bias? What does this mean for Canadians? Is this an issue only for Black people, Indigenous people, people of color? Or is this an issue which really affects everyone? So let's start with that last question first. I think it really does. It's an issue for everyone. You know, the Canada that we all want is a Canada which is healthy, which is prosperous, which is taking full advantage of all its peoples to ensure that we are designing policies that make sense, that are resilient, that we're creating economic opportunities so that everyone can participate in. And we have a pretty darn good track record in some of the things and some of the problems that once we've turned our minds to, we've started to take some firm stances to address them. I look no further than the women here who are key leaders in our community, who are key leaders in your community, who have, if you take a look at the work that's been done over the last 50 years in terms of the advancement for women, it's been really remarkable. We've made good progress. Have we reached where we want to go? No, but we've made good progress, and we still have more actions and activities that we have to take on to get there. And in doing so, we've created a much better country as a result. Policies that make more sense, policies that stick to the ground a lot more. We've created economic opportunities, which would be the envy of every other previous generation. So that is an example to show you of how we've come forward. We have to do the same thing to combat anti-Black racism. When we take a look at the formal, the legal barriers that existed for an embarrassingly long time in our country's history, and then we take a look at the informal policies that have continued and perhaps in some cases still continue, and certainly the unconscious biases which are the consequences of these obstacles and limitations and barriers. We have a lot of work to do. We've done some good work in the past, and we've moved the ball, moved the yardsticks down the field, but we still need to do more. And this is the reason why the Parliamentary Black Caucus had published a statement talking about what measures we can take to really combat anti-Black racism, systemic discrimination, and frankly, discrimination in all its forms. Now, why is it catching the attention of people right now, as in ways that it hasn't done before? And unfortunately, it took those brutal videos that we saw coming out of the United States a month ago now to sort of jar us awake. You know, a lot of people say we're way better than the United States, and in many respects that might be true. But to the person who is facing or who is at that the receiving end of discrimination, there's not much difference, which you can tell between one place and the other. When you're being blocked simply because of a prejudice, because of what someone conceives as the color of your skin, and then a whole bunch of beliefs that fall from that or flow from that, well then it's no fun. So what we're trying to do is put forward a number of actions and steps which we can take, and to because I hear a lot of non-Black Canadians ask, well, what can we do? We don't like what's happening and what we saw in those videos. We don't like the message that it sends. Black lives do matter. We believe that everyone should be not only be equal, but be treated equally and have equal opportunities. And to do that, people ask, what can we do? Well, here's a suite of things which we want to do, and I'll just describe it very quickly. One is that you want to keep on measuring this problem. Disaggregated data, that's collecting race-based data, and to use it in appropriate ways, because you can't change what you can't measure. So it's important for us to really start taking a look at all the decisions, all the things that we do, whether it's in education, in health, in security, in economy, and start taking a look, you know, are there differential effects for different communities? So that's a key thing. Second thing is that creating economic opportunities to give us those tools to overcome those barriers so that we can create wealth and prosperity, not only for Black Canadians, but certainly for all Canadians, because Black Canadians want to do our part to making sure that we can create economic prosperity for all Canadians. Thirdly, we obviously have to take a look at our justice and our public security systems to take a look at ways which we can try to overcome it. Because if you take all studies have shown, all things being equal, Blacks and Indigenous peoples are no more likely to commit a crime than non-Blacks or non-Indigenous peoples. But yet, 3 to 4 times more Blacks are arrested, remanded, and imprisoned with longer sentences. And if that weren't bad enough, when you take a look at Indigenous peoples, it's 7 to 8 times their demographic weight in the population that are arrested, remanded, and put in prison with longer sentences. So we need to really get at those issues so we can make sure that people don't feel targeted by the institutions of our own state, of our own government. Fourthly, we would want to make sure that we are represented at all levels in our public services, at all levels of government, to make sure that our public services are reflective of the diversity of its peoples, of its communities. I think that's really important to ensure that you're coming up with policies that everybody has input in, everybody can understand it. It wouldn't make sense for only men to make decisions about the entire population when half the population are female. So similarly, you would want to make sure that the decisions that are made by any community is made by the full diversity of the people that live in that community. And so you want to have representation all the way through. And finally, which is I know very important for many people in your riding, Joyce, is the notion of culture and the notion of heritage and the notion of arts. And this is very, very important for us to make sure that we're validating these stories. History is not something that is arbitrary, that's set in standard and it exists for all time. It depends on what look that we give it when we're in the present time and looking back on our past. So when you want to, you could find the role for women. When you want to, you could find the role for Indigenous peoples. When you want to, you could find the role for Black Canadians. So we want to make sure that we're a part of that story, and that story is also validated. So with that, Joyce, with those suite of things, the Parliamentary Black Caucus thinks that we'd be making a much better Canada that's living up to its ideals that we all wanted to live up to. And what's really great is just seeing so many people participating in this cause, in rallies and in discussion groups happening all across the country, and so many non-Black Canadians being part of that discussion. That's a key thing so that we can all move forward together and create a better Canada. So with that, thank you, Joyce.
Great. Thank you, Greg, and really appreciate the work that you've been doing on this. And I've appreciated being part of our annual Black History Month celebrations that I know you and the caucus were instrumental in organizing for the whole Black community to participate. We obviously have a lot more progress, as you've said. I think I had somebody on the chat here say, could we see that? Could you give us a link to the statement that Greg's talking about? And so the answer is yes. When we send notes or we send a note to people who participated on this meeting, we'll include that link. So thanks for all your work. Thanks for coming on our meeting. And now I have the pleasure of introducing an esteemed leader in our community, an academic, an activist, a friend, Dr. June Francis. Dr. Francis is the director of the Institute for Diaspora Research and Engagement at SFU. She's a professor of marketing at SFU. She's the co-chair of the Hogan's Alley Society and the co-founder of the Co-Laboratorio project that works to strengthen cross-sector collaboration, learning, and innovation for more inclusive and resilient solutions in governance, policies, and industry practice. So it does make me recognize why Dr. Francis, you and Parliamentary Secretary Fergus have been working together. You've as a leader, have made sure that those of us in government are aware of what we need to change. So, and Dr. Francis also was on my ad hoc advisory group for the Jericho lands a few years ago to make sure that the public's voice is involved right from the beginning in the thinking and planning around that development. As well as I recall, Dr. Francis, you were also part of my MP Women's Advisory Group. So thank you for being with us. I really look forward to your remarks, and over to you.
Thank you so very much, Joyce, for convening this. I must say that it's been heartening to see people advancing these conversations, and I want to also thank Greg for all the work you do representing us in the halls of power along with the other members of the Black Caucus, and really trying to think through how we can change at this time. I must say that when Joyce first came to me and we started discussing this, I've known Joyce, of course, for a long time. I was in a moment of exhaustion, and I said to Joyce, you know, part of the problem for us is that we have been at this juncture before. We have been here, and yet I do see that this is a moment, and the moment has changed because other Canadians, a vast majority of Canadians, 61% of Canadians have now indicated in pollings that they think systemic racism is a serious or somewhat serious issue. And so I think we're at a moment where the public is driving this agenda, and it's not just the Black community, and that makes an enormous difference because we can't change it. And at the beginning, I was saying to many people, you tell me how you dismantle it because you built it. So you need to have a plan because I didn't build it. But I recognize that that needed a lot more clarification, but it was the moment where I wanted to make sure everyone understood this wasn't just our problem, this is Canada's problem. So I'm going to share with you a slide deck here. I hope that works out well. If not, I'll make the remarks. So I'm trying to share this with you, and I think it would be a more efficient way to proceed. So hopefully we're going to see this. So you notice I put this time because I am very interested in discussing how this time we might see a different tomorrow. But I want to say this, and one of the things that I had to recognize is that I cannot walk forward and ask people to come with me if people don't truly understand the problem. And I must say I resist having to go over territories that we have all gone over. But in our collaboratoria, one of the things we've learned as we bring people together, we have to remind people of the causes, the history, and in some way, this is inevitable. I would like to move beyond that, but I think we're Canadians, the questions I'm getting still, is it as bad? Did it happen? Really? And so the question I ask all of us to consider really deeply is, why is anti-Black racism Canada's best kept secret? Why is it, how did we hide? And I say 2 centuries of slavery in plain sight. Like, how did we do that? How did we not know that from 1628 to 1834, slavery existed legally in this country? And it was abolished at the same time across the Commonwealth countries. So, but how did we not know this? Because it takes effort. And this effort is the systemic racism. It's part of it. And we remember, all know about the Underground Railway, which occurred over decades, yet we forget the centuries that have gone. I point everybody to a poem by the former Canadian parliamentary poet laureate George Eliot Clark, entitled "Why is Black Slavery Whited Out?" I encourage you to read that poem or listen to it. He actually narrates it. So how did we forget? Well, I won't go through this long list, but I'll pick a few. I think our self-perception. I even heard this from a senior health authority at the beginning of COVID-19, who lectured me on a national call of Black leaders not to worry about racism because we live in Canada after all. And as we know, we didn't have the data, and he suggested we didn't need it in Canada because he used the word, we're colorblind society. I want you to see my color and all my beauty. I hope you see beauty, because I do want you to see what I bring to Canada. I do want you to see my color. Multiculturalism, and I'll discuss this further, but another issue for us, how has that worked? And I think we have to reconsider everything. So we've been erased, as Greg said, from statistics. There's no data. And we have also seen that we have been, so many times there's a justification for why we become incarcerated, but it's not based in fact. It's based in the narrative. It can rely on Canadian stereotype, and it does so effectively. How do we forget when we put up statues like this one in St. John's, New Brunswick, sorry, the first mayor, Gabriel Ludlow, a slave owner, who implemented a range of anti-Black policies. And I can't go into all of them, but trust me, they directly impacted lives in significant ways. How do we not know that Queen's University until 1918 banned Black students? And it was only revoked in 2018, although informally, they started to accept students only in 1965. And you need to know that prior to 1918, Black students were attending the medical school at Queen's. So how do we, I'm sorry, I have to go back to this, that James McGill, we all send our students, our kids off to McGill University. Remember, he was a slave owner. I just want us all to remember that. How did we forget that in 1911, the Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier, and his cabinet approved an order in council banning Black people from entering Canada. And he says, and it's here, there is a prohibition against any immigrants belonging to the Black race. Now, this was never put into force, but it didn't matter. It had the effect of the institutionalizing in the immigration system. And for decades, Black Canadians were denied entry. And we have the evidence, one of them that in 1911, 40 Black immigrants were turned away from my own border here at White Rock and told they could not enter Canada. And this went on across this country. And that's why we don't have the population. How do we ignore the stories of Black resistance while shopping with a $10 bill in our hands? I thought finally all Canadians are now using this $10 bill. They'll ask themselves, why was Viola Desmond a successful Black businesswoman? She was jailed and convicted and fined because she refused to leave a white-only area in a movie theater in 1946. And all of us remember Rosa Parks, but why do we not know this? And look at her. And in the Black community, I'll tell you, we recognize her features made her very desirable in white society because she was proximate to whiteness. And with all of that, she could not escape the racism in Canada. We are exhausted, and we're exhausted because of the distraction. We're not and we just want to bring our ingenuity and our incredible talents and have it help build this country we chose as our home, or we're born here. This is what we want to do. We want to rise to the level of our interest and competence. We want to have the same opportunities, but it's denied us. We are exhausted, as Toni Morrison say, because of distractions. And I won't read this entire thing by Toni Morrison, but I will say that she said the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work, it keeps you explaining over and over again your reason to exist. And I feel that way as a Black Canadian. I find myself at the same point saying, I'm allowed to be brilliant. I don't have to explain that. I don't have to explain that I am a professor. I don't have to explain that. I don't have to explain that I live on the west side of Vancouver when the police decides my children don't live here. I'm exhausted by being followed in the supermarket. I'm exhausted from coming across the border and being strip searched because, not physically, but everything else, because I am instead of being a world traveler, I'm seen as a drug dealer. I am exhausted. I am simply exhausted from existing and having to defend myself. So we once again put our bodies on the line to explain again that Black Lives Matter. Think about that. We actually have to tell you that, or we have to explain this. Does this make any sense to anybody? anti-Black racism persists, and as Greg pointed out, Black Canadians are 20 times as likely to be shot by the police. In Vancouver, Black Canadians are 5 times. Indigenous people are 8. And I want to show you this. This was a just breaking polling that asks, this is where data matters. Did you ask Canadians, did you feel safe when you had to interact with police officers? Safe, not protected, not served, just safe. And literally less than half, 42% of Canadians that are Black identifying said they were safe. Most Canadians were saying they weren't feeling safe. Black Canadians, okay? Now let me go back to the non-visible minority group. 80% felt safe. So you're talking about 80% versus 40. Now, 42. Now, why is that? Because the police was always there to catch slaves, to protect a white population against Indigenous people. They're doing their jobs, and nobody has ever stopped them. Their jobs is to protect some people's lives. And it has always been that way. And the others are not. We're to protect your lives against us. That's essentially what has happened. And yet it took 2 takes for the commissioner, Brenda Luckey, to say, yes, I acknowledge that there is systemic racism. What would it take? Chief Adam was on the ground. What is it gonna take to get the system to actually say something? Prime Minister Trudeau, okay, he took a knee and he went to the first ministers and said, let's put out a statement on anti-Black racism. And yet, first ministers could not agree across this country to condemn, to declare anti-Black racism, systemic racism, not even anti-Black racism, systemic racism. Indigenous people and Black people are just shuddering at this. Could not get a statement across this country. But others seem to notice. The UN report on the working group that came here in 2017 had this to say, and I hope everybody has read it, because the outsider who looked on our society said, despite Canada's reputation of promoting multiculturalism and diversity, the working group is deeply concerned about the human rights situation of Canadians. Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation, and marginalization has had a deleterious impact of people of African descent. But why has multiculturalism, why did they bring up this work of multiculturalism? And I'm gonna say something that I know for Canadians who deeply, and I too, when I came to this country, and still believe in this notion of multiculturalism. But let me suggest that in its form and the way it's functioned, it has not worked for Black Canadians. And there's a reason that I want you to consider. So when I make this point that it's white supremacist and white centering, I want you to understand clearly what I'm saying, because I want you to hear me. Multiculturalism has put all of us who are not. And so we have become the other to the Canadian society. And it continues to therefore center Canada as a white society and the rest of us as the other. And then it does something even more insidious. It hides the disproportionate impact of some members of that group. So multiculturalism sets up the country as a white country and us as the other. And what we want to have is a country where when we say multiculturalism, white culture is just another culture as part of this Canadian mosaic, not the centered one, okay? The other thing is, Black people use this statement, and I want you to understand it. You like our culture, but you don't like us, okay? We feel multiculturalism has worked to include our cultural, some of our culture. So while we're allowed to be singers and you like our food and we are exotic and you do enjoy us as people because we wear unusual clothes and our hair is a certain way, that's the extent of it. You like our culture. So the top rappers in Canada and in the world are Black Canadians. Allowed to run in the Olympics as long as we don't do anything wrong like Ben Johnson, then we are no longer Canadians. There are aspects of the society where we in fact try, and Canadians have accepted some degree of our inclusion, but it has not gone to the economic inclusion, the political inclusion, the true value that we need in the society to exist. I heard Donovan Bailey yesterday, and I heard one of our Black hockey players, and I don't even know if it's true in sports because they talk about the deeply racist incidences that they had. So despite the reputation for promoting multiculturalism and diversity, the same UN working group said they're deeply concerned about structural racism in Canada, and that lies at the core of Canadian institution, and this is systemic racism. So this is a point I wanted to make, is that Canada, by not collecting data, and I thank you for that in the Black Caucus, manages to hide behind a variety of things. One of them is this issue of visible minorities, okay? So I want to show you this, and I want to see if I can quickly explain it. So across the top, this line that goes straight across is the one you're comparing everything to. And that's non-racialized, otherwise known as white Canadians. So if we take the income of white Canadians as a starting point, and this is some Stats Canada data that the Center for Policy Alternative analyzed. And then we look at a second line, this blue line, and each nodule here, first generation, second generation, third generation. So if you look at the first generation, what you see is this, if we say white Canadians are 1, then we come down to all visible minorities, all racialized group, 0.74. But if we look at Black Canadians in particular, we're at the end and it's 0.68. So we earn 68 cents on the dollar when we arrive here. What happens in the second generation? We creep up to 69 cents on the dollar. And in 2017, we made it all the way up to 70 cents on the dollar. What other racialized group have gone up and almost closed this gap. Okay, it matters that we have done studies on the visible minorities, not even Black Canadians per se. And what do I find? That in the halls of power, the leadership in this country, there is a hegemony of white supremacy. I don't mean that in a negative way, only that white power is supreme and white ideas dominate our society, and the rest of us are desperately squeezed out of these halls. So if you look at visible minorities on governance boards in Metro Vancouver, the blue part is the place where visible minorities occur. So if you see the orange part, it's the white population. So if you look at something like libraries, why is it that in a city, by the way, an area where 51% are visible minorities, 51. And this is the story across the country. It doesn't matter if it's Toronto, same 13%, same tokenism. Average of this is tokenism. These are the numbers, these are the facts. So this time, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go to this time, and Teska, I'll be done shortly. This time. So we know that 60% of Canadians believe systemic racism is a serious problem. And I know that you're working on it, and I applaud all the sorts of issues you bring up. I particularly like the fact that we have moved away from belonging and a variety of things to this question of economic opportunity and all the various representation at the start. These are all good points, and I applaud them. But I think this is a moment for us to consider, it's an opportunity, as you said, Joyce. It's an opportunity. It's a moment for Canada to reset to a new normal, a normal where we are included. And I say this, it's an opportunity, grab it. And we need transformative and systemic change. Transformative. So I'm glad we're all doing training on microaggressions and all of that, but let's be clear, we're doing all of that to remedy the deficiency of a population that has deeply embedded racial attitudes. It doesn't help us. It simply is fixing a deficit. And if that's all we do, we will continue to see the same people in power. So we need an official apology, I think. I think this is the only way the federal government, and I'll stick here because you are representative of the federal government, I think we need an apology. Discussion. I think Canada did a great thing when it acceded to the decade of people of African descent. Most Canadians will ask, what is that? Canada signed up because nobody has paid attention. And I know that money has started to flow, but too little and a bit late. And I would say that we're halfway through this decade for justice, for recognition, for development. Let's move on that. I think this is a moment where we have to start to talk about reparations and redress. Ogunzali Society that I'm part of is working with the city of Vancouver. It's not moving. We have federal partners that need to come to the table to redress the displacement of the Black community. It has cost us dearly, and yet it doesn't. We need to follow UN recommendations and think deeply about why they said to recognize African Canadians as a specific group. The reason for that is that we have a specific history, and it's deeply embedded across this country and in fact across the world. We also need to come up with new systems that center Black Canadians in its inception, in its privilege, in its power. We need to also use the office to do things like legislation, procurement, budgeting. And I ask you, is it the time for an anti-racism budget, as Greg alluded to? Not his words, mine, but that's my point. So, with Rick and Carol to sing us a song, and I'd ask you to join in. Because in fact, in a racist society, as Angela Davis told us, it is not enough to be non-racist. We all must be working hard every day to dismantle this. Because if you're not dismantling it, you're actually supporting it. We must all actually act to be anti-racist. And I'll ask Rick and Carol if they would now share a song, and I'd ask you all to join in. I know we can't hear you, but if you would, because it is a commitment that I'm asking you to make.
Thank you very much, June. Go ahead, Rick.
Yes, thank you. We're delighted to be here to share Ella's song. And it's a song I think all of you can join in on very easily, because if I were to poll you and ask you, do you believe in freedom? I'm sure you would all say yes. And so that is the refrain that is the song title and spirit. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. The title, as an aside, is Ella's song. Ella was Ella Baker, a largely unsung hero of the civil rights movement, performed an important function in the NAACP, Martin Luther King's campaign, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was very influential as an advocate for the principle of nonviolence that she had learned in school as a Gandhian principle.
And just before we start, June, you should hear this as a song of the community supporting you and others in leadership, because we realize you're exhausted, but it's important that the rest of us don't just sit back and rest.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Try it along with us. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
The older I get, the better I know that the secret to my going on is that the reins are in the hands of the young who know to run against the storm.
Oh, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. And struggling myself don't mean a whole lot, I've come to realize. But teaching others to join in the fight is the only way this struggle survives.
So we who believe in freedom cannot rest.
We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Last time now. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick and Carol, for singing that, and really Dr. June Francis for sharing. We can really tell your passion and your convictions, and also for enlightening us in all this. We have had a number of questions come in through the Q&A. I'm also cognizant of time, and so I will try to summarize a couple questions and pass it over. Maybe we'll have some time for you to answer one question, and then we'll pass it to Joyce to close off the conversation. But I do want to make enough time to answer the many questions that come in, so I would invite, if folks are interested in staying on afterwards beyond the set time, they're welcome to do so, and we can continue the conversation there. But first, the question, and it really relates to both MP Greg Fergus, your recommendations, but also your call for collecting data. One of the questions was around whether BC is collecting race-based data currently or not, and if so, why not? And that question came from Liz Riley. And Dr. June Francis, I just asked if you want to speak to this, if you can unmute yourself at this moment.
Okay, I'm finally unmuted. I just want to quickly say happy birthday to Rick. I was at his Zoom party yesterday as he celebrated his 80th birthday, and Carol, dear friends from long ago, so thank you for the song. Yes, this race-based data. BC has been reluctant. I can't tell you how difficult it has been here in British Columbia. As you know, many of you know that we have asked for this, and to this point, during COVID-19, the health department has been very reluctant, and it has something to do. I've heard our premier say we don't want to stigmatize with data. Well, don't. Ignorance is not a substitute for not stigmatizing. So we continue to push. We see some avenues for change, but it's not changing in dramatic ways in British Columbia. So homeless count, I've worked in the homeless population here to redress homelessness among Black and Indigenous people. And we had to push. Finally, we have a proper race-based question on that questionnaire. So it continues to be an ongoing struggle, and we're flying in the dark here.
Dr. Francis has responded quite eloquently to this. I'm not aware of the situation in British Columbia, but I certainly know that in the past there have been abuses in terms of the collection of race-based data. So I just take it as a tenet in my faith in people, is that in 2020, that if we were to start collecting race-based data, it's because we want to make our policies more efficient, and there are proper ways of doing that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are many jurisdictions in the world that have done this before, and we just have to follow their best guidelines in collecting that data and then using it appropriately. I have a lot of confidence in Statistics Canada in their collection of this data to making sure that it's scientifically valid. And I think it just needs to be done because, as Dr. Francis showed us in those graphs, there is a whole world of difference that is captured, or a whole world of variation that's captured in the term visible minority. And I think that if we want to have efficient policy, we want to spend our tax dollars properly, you would want to make sure that they're spent in the right places to have the maximum effect. And to do that, you need to collect this race-based data to see if there are any differentials.
Thank you both for answering that question. I do know that we have about 5 minutes left before this webinar is scheduled to finish off. So I did want to pass it to Joyce to have a bit of time to thank you both and sum up the webinar. But if there are folks that want to stay on afterwards, I think I would love to continue to answer some of the questions and to address in particular some of the questions that folks had. Joyce, would you like to come on and to just share your thoughts?
Well, thank you, Tessica. And those of you in the audience who have been at my breakfast before might recognize Tessica as one of our guest speakers, whose I've had the good fortune of working with these past months at my office in Ottawa. So she was our speaker on social isolation and loneliness in Vancouver. Thank you, Tessica, for being the moderator for this Zoom meeting. June, that was so incredibly powerful. I mean, I'm almost wordless. It was so much that I didn't know about our racist history, and that is exactly your point. We don't know Canada's racist history and how damaging that is today yet. And so thank you for that. I would like your permission to be able to share those slides in my next e-blast, which goes more broadly than the audience here today. And so I see you nodding, so thank you. And I loved the song and how that brought us all into the commitment to be anti-racist. So it also makes me mindful of my background. So I came here at age 7 from South Africa. My parents did not accept the apartheid regime and didn't want to raise their children in it. But I have a heritage that is deeply implicated in anti-Black racism. And for that, I want to personally apologize for my part in that through my heritage. And I pledge to work with you, Greg, with Parliamentary Secretary Fergus, to seek to get an apology by Parliament for our anti-Black racist history here in Canada, an apology to the Black community. So those on the meeting that need to leave, I just want to thank you for being part of this, and I want to, but what I would really love to do is stay a bit longer myself, and so that I can hear other questions that may be presented to Dr. Francis. This is a hugely educational and moving experience for me as someone who has convened many meetings. I would say this is certainly one of the unquestionably one of the most powerful. And so I want to thank my team, Tessica, and the others who are behind the scenes here helping me organize this event, and the others that I do that allow me to connect. Yeah, thank you, Greg. Allow me to connect powerful speakers like Dr. Francis with the community so that we can have a dialogue together and make a difference to our society and our country. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Tessica, our moderator, to see if there are other questions. And for those who need to leave, I understand. And for those who would like to stay on, we'll continue for another 10 minutes. And then we'll, if with Dr. Francis willing, I know your schedule is very tight. Is this something that you're able to do? Okay, so another, we'll end the virtual Zoom meeting at 10 past, and that gives us a bit more time for questions and discussion. So thanks all, and over to you, Tessica.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those words, and I think the apology as well. So we have a question here from Margaret Rempel, and also a question that came in earlier in advance from Casey Reeds, both in regards to the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on Black and Indigenous folks in Canada. I'm saying that, you know, Black folks and people of color and Indigenous folks are unfairly placed in prison, and they have longer sentencing times. And so just speaking to any recommendations or perspectives that you have on what can be changed within the criminal justice system.
Yes, I don't know, I'll start since I started speaking. Serious problematic area, and it's not just the police. It runs across all of our law enforcement. So if you think about Border Service Agency, you talk all the way to security guards in supermarkets. Every time there has been where and criminalized, we are disproportionately impacted, as are Indigenous people. And you have to ask, why is that, right? And the reason is these forces, their policies, the culture that got created from the get-go had a purpose. And the purpose really was to protect stolen lands and stolen people. It really was. And so here you have a country built on the protection of one group as we steal lands, right? We're stealing people's lands. And then we protect us, the white people, let's just say, from the Indigenous people. And that same logic meant that we as property, right, were only protected as property, but not as people. So that if we ran away, the slave catchers caught us, right? So I don't want to go on much longer, but to say, we have to interrogate all aspects of the criminal justice system, including judges, who are sitting in judgment, and many laws as well. So there's a deeply problematic, and I support re-examining all of that and asking us, how much do we want to spend on law enforcement as opposed to protection and service and having thriving communities?
Thanks, Dr. June Francis. Greg, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick about this, although it's a really complex question. So I agree with everything Dr. Francis said, especially that we have to look larger than just police, got to take a look at border security and all that. You know, I think it really comes down to this. We have to have a really big rethink as to how do we improve security of our communities. And I say security, I don't mean you know, legal security, you know, and with guns and stuff. But how do we make sure that we respond to mental health issues well? How do we make sure that we respond to drug issues well, drug intoxication issues, drug addiction issues? How do we talk about social services? When I was speaking to Commissioner Lucky of the RCMP last week, she had brought forward a really stunning figure. 99.27% of all interventions at the 99.827% of all interventions are without violence. So if that's the case, why do we go into situations with, you know, armed officers, body protection suits? I know we got to protect for the worst case scenario, but it seems to me that 7 times in 1,000 that comes up. So maybe we should start hiving off different calls to different groups who are better prepared, better able to de-escalate, better prepared, better trained to deal with some issues. And I think those are some really important things. So more mental health workers, more addiction specialists, more social workers. And for the cases where there's a reasonable expectation of violence or potential for violence, well, then you've got to make sure that we work these things together. So working with police services who are trained to do that kind of work, and the other social services, which I think are more, which are more qualified to deal with those kind of interventions. Second thing we have to do, we've got to get rid of mandatory minimums. Let judges be judges. That's why we pay them. We don't put computers on the bench. We put people on the bench to try to take things into account and understand what would be the best way to, again, increase the public's security. Just a little story. I went, one of the first things I did as a member of parliament, we have the right as members of parliament to go to military bases or to prisons and to visit them. I went to a prison to visit, and I can tell you they're terrible places. Every Canadian should have an opportunity to visit a prison, because once you do that, you'd say you never want to put anybody there. The only people you want to put there are the people who are truly a menace to society. We have to find alternative ways of dealing with people who break different kinds of laws that don't threaten people. And we can learn from other jurisdictions in the world which do it better than we do.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that. We also had a bunch of questions related to the theme of education. I think one really asking about this history that's so important that you shared with us, Dr. June Francis. Why is this not in the school curriculum, and whether there's an opportunity to incorporate that into the education system? But beyond that, I think mentioning also the response or the lack of response to racist actions within different school districts, and how school districts might be able to respond more appropriately to racism, and particularly anti-Black racism as it relates to police and schools.
Yes, now this is something so close to my heart, only because I am a professor and I have been stunned at the institution that is so foundational to Canadian society, educational institutions. They have feared, and in fact, I think have created some of this systemic racism. So if you look at school systems across this country, ill-equipped, they have continued the erasure of Black history, complete erasure. My kids tried to write stories and we're often told that that's not Canadian history. And I'm not making this up. We saw the other day that somebody thought it would be a good idea to have an assignment where the students were asked to argue on behalf of taking Indigenous people's lands, and that they would get more marks if they could put on a persuasive argument for why Indigenous people should give up their lands. This is such a, so we know from the statistics that Black children in our school are streamed for failure. And it emanates up all the way to universities. Universities have been the most intractable. Look at your faculty, look at them. There have been a handful of Black professors at Simon Fraser, and I think we have a handful minus at this point. It has not changed, despite the fact that we claim to be giving courses on African history and Black history. We do not change the power. If you look at the leadership of universities, entirely white across most of this country. And so what we're seeing is that it's crowded out the voices of Black Canadians, and educators can't get up in the system. We're not given the positions of power and privilege. And when we talk about it, we're sidelined, and other people, in fact, take on this task. So it is a deeply deep, and one of the most significant problems is the racism. And I'll end with just a quick story. A few months ago in Vancouver, two things happened in our school. One was there was a Cecil B. Rhodes plaque at one of our schools. And if you had any notion of who Cecil B. Rhodes is, and I encourage you to Google him, Oxford has just taken down his statue. He, and maybe Joyce knows this because he was a South African and an author of apartheid. And yet, when the Black students asked for that plaque to come down, it took the school board forever to make that decision. And then the principal said, I am in the middle. I don't even know who he is. That level of just erasure, it's just impossible. We also had a situation where a white student threatened black students at the school, and the police thought it wasn't a big deal. And so we continue to see the failure. And I'm sorry I've taken this long, because it is my passion. One of my passion projects is because I think it's so systemically important.
Very quickly, I just think that we need to, long before we get to the university, we have to also take a look at what we're doing in primary schools and secondary schools, and ask ourselves a very uncomfortable situation. How is it that Black students end up being several times their demographic weight and population are receive detentions, are encouraged not to apply to universities, but are streamed into more vocational schools, or if not, to continue in post-secondary education. These are big issues that we need to start looking at the elementary school level, at the secondary school level. No one's born with prejudices. They develop over time, and we have to make sure that we take stands to make sure that we fight against that.
I know we're about to leave, but I will pick up on one point, and I'll be brief. I went to the University of British Columbia when I wanted to do a PhD, and I've shared this story. And I was told that for people like me, it would be really hard to do a PhD in business. I was discouraged, I was defeated, I was hurt, and I might cry, because it was a stab to me. I had great grades, and yet I was being turned away. Think about when that happens to you in elementary school. I finished my degree in the States because of that specific incidence of being turned away at a university.
Dr. June Francis, I'm feeling so emotional. I feel your grief. I feel your pain. And MP Joyce Murray, I think, thank you so much for hosting and convening us together. Dr. MP Chris, it's been wonderful hearing your recommendations and your passion, and to see you in the halls of power really pushing for change and bringing so many MPs along. I think you've already inspired so many of us. I'm seeing here in the comments someone who runs the Vancouver Maritime Museum looking at how we might be able to change the stories and to tell new narratives and make sure that Black communities are represented in there. And I would encourage everyone who's listening on this webinar to think about in what communities and in what spaces you have agency and power to make sure that you're combating anti-Black racism and really dismantling some of that systemic discrimination. Thank you so much. Thank you both for joining us here on the webinar, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Francis, thank you. Joyce, amazing as always. You've been a great friend and ally, and we really, it's because we have allies like you that we're going to make progress. And Tessica, thank you as well for moderating this, and to the staff, great job. And to everybody who participated, thank you for coming out, because this is an important issue, but one which we can fix.
And thank you. I see there's still 100 people there, and that's a testament to your commitment to this conversation. Thank you so very much, Joyce and Greg and Tessica, and thank you so much, Rick and Carol, for contributing enormously to this conversation as we try to make a new tomorrow for Black Canadians.
And for all Canadians. We'll all be better off when we're all equal.
Of course. I mean, that's the point, isn't it, Greg?
It is. It is.
Canada becomes the true Canada that we all want. Exactly. We are all committed to a Canada that includes us all. This is what we're fighting for. We could all pack our bags and move to a little corner somewhere, but we all believe in this great country and its promise. And I think the promise is great. It is enormous. We have the chance for leadership on this issue, that we have the opportunity. And I must tell you, 61% of Canadians agree with us. And I bet you the others just don't understand, because I think this is a place and a moment where Canadians are coming along. And for all of us, I think this is a critical moment.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the
Go ahead, Joyce.
For the closing comments, and to everyone who came to our MP Brunch Connections, thank you so much. We will be having another one in July, towards the end of July, probably like this one, a Monday at 11 o'clock. The topic is yet to be determined, so I would love for anyone that would like to weigh in to send me a note on whether you think that this could be about our economic recovery, about environment transition. Here's a poll that Tessica has put together for us, and I would love it if you would take a moment to weigh in on the poll as we determine who our next speakers will be. And Tessica, should I wait for this poll to be done before I tie off the meeting? I'm not sure the technology.
Yeah, and then I can end the poll once we've had most responses come in.
So is everybody seeing the poll on your screen?
Yeah, we have most, I think about 80% of people that have participated already, and that number continues to rise. So. Okay, that's everyone. So I think what we're seeing.
Okay, well. Yeah, so we'll take a look at that, and as we're thinking about guest speakers and topics, your input will be important to me. So it's a huge privilege to be able to convene people as a member of Parliament, and it's been very moving, as I think we've all experienced, Dr. Francis and Greg, Parliamentary Secretary, as well as Rick and Carol for just adding that extra dimension to our event today. Thank you. Have a great rest of the week, and a safe summer. And thanks for being part of this. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.